Very good evening to everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. So I welcome you all for yet another Friday lecture by Team CSP. So like each Friday, we bring to you a new speaker with a new topic with a interesting and exciting new Friday lecture. So we have such an exciting lecture planned for you today also. So without any further ado, I'll request Meera Menon to please introduce today's speaker and also the topic. Over to you, Meera.
Yeah, thank you, Niharika. Is Amala here? I don't see her. Amala?
She's here.
Video?
Yeah,
Amala, could you please switch
Hi,
on the...
hi, Meera. I'm here.
she's here.
Okay. Oh, hi, I can't see,
Hi.
but all right. Hey, okay, long time. So, hello everybody. It's my immense pleasure to welcome Amala today. Amala is a very good friend of mine, and she is also one of the most hardworking and also fun-loving person I know. So, Amala is a literary scholar interested in exploring the intersections between medicine and literature. She's currently pursuing her PhD in the Department of English and Writing Studies at Western University, Ontario. She holds an MA in English Studies from the Manipal Center for Humanities, Mahi, with an interdisciplinary orientation to philosophy and sociology. Her research focuses on the expression of the self in medical memoir and the possibilities of reimagining the spectrum of health through reading medical memoirs. She's also a freelance writer and an editor of academic papers. Her first book, released by MUP in 2019, is a study of personal narratives that engage with notions of health and illness, titled Writing the Self in Illness. So I'll definitely speak more about the book, and I'm sure most of Amla's research is also based on it today. Her talk would be based on her work, Writing the Self in Illness. So how do medical memoirs foreground the experiential in writing? And can we look at memoirs as not merely a reflection of the experiential, but also one of artistic value? These are some of the questions that I have, and also I'm sure Amala also did while she started writing the book. So we'll hear more about it from her. So over to you, Amala.
Thank you so much, Meera, for introducing me with such a generous description. I want to start by expressing my pleasure and gratitude to NIAS for this opportunity. So in my master's research at the Manipal Center for Humanities, I was drawn to experiential accounts of illness through a medical humanities course, which was taught by Dr. Gayatri Prabhu. I started wondering what was unique to these texts of life writing about illness, and began to realize that they were all speaking back to the contemporary medical discourse in very interesting and insightful ways. So in my talk on life writing about illness today, I'll start by introducing the field of health humanities, where my research is situated, and more specifically discuss why life narratives about illness are important contributions to both literature and medicine. This talk is, of course, by no means comprehensive in capturing the vast number of literary and artistic contributions to the field. Instead, I hope to try and reflect on the need for life writing to be read for its transformative potential. So, drawing from health humanities expert Andrea Cherries at the University of Toronto, health humanities is a fast-growing interdisciplinary field that explores human health and illness through the methods and material of the creative arts and humanities. It consists of a variety of approaches. One involves theoretical considerations of health, illness, disability, and embodiment, along with the aesthetics of representing illnesses like AIDS, cancer, dementia, or depression in various creative media. But the field also encompasses more applied, hands-on practices, such as the use of arts-based health interventions, art therapy, narrative medicine, universal design, and healthcare architecture, to name just a few. Health humanities essentially challenges this disciplinary divide between the sciences and humanities by forming alliances and connections across methods of arts and humanities with health and medical sciences. So my own interest is coming from that place of having always been invested in biology and literature at the same time. So moving on to narrative medicine, this was developed by Dr. Rita Sharon at Columbia University along with her team. And it's a form of practicing medicine which is geared to listening to the patient, to seeing the person and having a sense of their whole story, to sort of absorb and receive the entirety of the story, including the unsaid hints, and seeing person and not just patient. So the idea of narrative medicine is to be moved by the person, to honor an individual and let them guide the narrative as the best advocate of their own bodies. So Rita Sharon claims that physicians should be able to analyze their patient stories at the level of form, not just content, and develop narrative competence through the practice of close reading, which is a method that we use in literary analysis. So that is one of the examples of how practices in both medicine and literature are sort of trying to come together in this field. And the aspect of health humanities and narrative medicine that I wish to talk about today is life writing specifically, and what I refer to as medical memoirs because of their contributions to our understanding of health, disease, and recovery. So the question that I would like to start with is, what is it that compels writers to put their experiences out in the world, to forego the privacy of their lives and be exposed to criticism and accusations of navel gazing? So a commitment to narrate life as it has happened in relation to a certain event or a time span, the urge to bear witness is often the reason cited by different writers. Along with this, making sense of experience through writing in the search of closure or clarity, this marks another function of the literary memoir. So in general, we know that writing experience involves writing about relationships with people and how they shape particular life events and processes. Now, the contemporary understanding of memoir is that it comprises of a shorter span of events than that which is encompassed in an autobiography. So memoir's focus can be thought of ranging across a continuum of writing, of memoirs that focus on the author at one end, so a personal memoir in a very direct sense, and those that focus on a family member or a loved one at the other. This continuum is one way of understanding the sort of challenge or impossibility of writing one's life narrative without describing other people and events, or even about how can we write about a close one without highlighting an intimate relationship with that person. But essentially, the memoir form itself captures a central human impulse, which is the narration of our lives in our own words and terms. And if we get into the specific formal and political interventions that medical memoirs make in response to contemporary notions of health and illness, one is their departure from convention. Now, often, general memoirs end on a positive, reflective note in the spirit of offering closure or resolution at the conclusion. But this note of positivity is not shared across the board by memoirs of illness that discuss experiences of trauma or of irrevocable losses and their significance for thinking about self and finitude in the world. Most importantly, illness and the toll that it takes on an individual as well as the people who surround them, it does not provide closure or make sense. And what's beautiful about medical memoirs is that this messiness is captured by them. Paul Monet, who wrote Borrowed Time, a memoir on AIDS, captures a moving account of the painful goodbye to his partner and his own knowledge of impending death. So I'd like to quote his closing lines, which sort of convey this departure from genre convention. To quote, putting off as long as I could the desolate waking to life alone, this calamity that is all mine, that will not end till I do. End quote. So the meaning of this is very significant for Monet because at the time he's writing the memoir, he's also afflicted with AIDS and has just said goodbye to his partner. While referring to the grief of losing his partner, he's also referring to his uncertain future in a political upheaval of a lack of recognition in the US in the 1980s. So another instance is Pete Early in his memoir titled Crazy, A Father's Search Through America's Mental Health Madness. In the last lines, he writes about his son, quote, his illness was not ending because I was writing the final chapter of this book. There would be no living happily ever after sentence on the last page, end quote. So Early here directly addresses that convention of ending on a positive note, only to suggest that it does not make sense for his memoir and his son Mike's illness. So as readers, we're being invited to embrace that messiness and that uncertainty that comes with acknowledging the finitude of life. This is one of the distinguishing aspects of medical memoirs. Now, medical memoirs very significantly question truths that have been created by scientific facts and which we in turn assimilate in our own bodies. And they do so by examining how a particular individual body modifies and transforms the discourse of illness in question. The medical memoir's potential lies in refashioning the cultural environment and the dominant perceptions of that social milieu's scientific discourses and biases. So it sort of holds up a mirror to that monolith of medical certainty. So American clinical psychologist K. Redfield Jamison, whose work is centered around bipolar disorder, in her memoir titled An Unquiet Mind, addresses the questions and debates surrounding lithium and psychotherapy in the late 20th century. So I would like to quote her, begin quote, pills do not ease one back into reality. They only bring one back headlong, careening, and faster than can be endured at times. Psychotherapy is a sanctuary. It is a battleground. It is a place I've been psychotic, neurotic, elated, confused, and despairing beyond belief. But always it is where I have believed or have learned to believe that I might someday be able to contend with all of this. No pill can help me deal with the problem of not wanting to take pills. Likewise, no amount of psychotherapy alone can prevent many manias and depressions. I need both. It is an odd thing owing life to pills, one's own quirks and tenacities, and this unique, strange, and ultimately profound relationship called psychotherapy. Now, end quote. We are drawn to the force and vitality of Jamison's writing, but she's making a very poignant political statement in this writing because as a clinical psychologist, the writing of illness into her memoir is a public sort of expression that has very serious consequences and aspects in her own life. Not to mention that she kind of takes this debate, one of the key medical debates of the 21st century, the necessity of a combination of medication and psychotherapy in psychiatric illness, or the importance of emphasizing medicine or just psychotherapy. And she takes her position and makes it very clear, sort of stating that for her, it's a combination that's worked. And by doing so, she also, by using that personal narrative here, she changes the textbook nature of medical prescriptions, and she transforms them in her writing. So medical memoirs can also sometimes challenge illness diagnoses by rejecting them or commenting on them to express a sense of being wronged. And this again is very important, as this is not something we often get an opportunity to do with the sort of structural limitations in the practice of medicine today. So an instance of this is Susanna Kayson's memoir in 1993 titled Girl Interrupted. So in this memoir, when we open the memoir, Kayson shares her diagnosis records of borderline personality disorder in the first 2 pages. So we can see her private medical records. And then the literary move she makes is the rest of the memoir is a reworking of this diagnosis, because she overturns it and challenges it and responds to it with a sort of sardonic wit. And she does so by describing the process and the carelessness and the lack of explanation that she gets before she's admitted to the hospital. And she questions this idea of normalcy in a very poignant manner. Let's talk about some of the key concerns of memoir writing as authors themselves describe in their work, especially in life narratives on illness. In her memoir, Searching for Mercy Street, Linda Gray Sexton, who's the daughter of famous poet Anne Sexton, addresses a concern that exists about the truth of the memoir. How do we know what these writers are saying to be true, right? And she responds to that question by saying that how she explains it is how remembering her life differently from the way in which the rest of her family did can be explained by the experience of writing a memoir, which for her is like coming into a room where everyone is present, but entering through a different door than they have. By this, Linda Gray Sexton is drawing attention to how the ethics of writing a memoir largely lies within an accountability to the self to be true as best as possible to one's own account of something. And the ethics of life writing also lies in its relational aspects. The serious danger posed by the memoir in relation to the ethics of disclosure sort of lies in, as you can imagine, an impossibility in concealing the identities of the people it refers to. So this implies that the memoirist has obligations to others as well. And memoirs that rise out of intimate relationships can be particularly difficult to accept by close ones, and they can be especially contested by the very people that they attempt to illuminate through the writing. So when we think of literary memoirs, distinguished professor and author of the notable literary criticism text, The Mad Woman in the Attic, Susan Gubar's memoir of her journey since a diagnosis of ovarian cancer in 2008 comes to mind. In strong and critical tones, Susan Gubar weaves personal experience in this memoir with a critique of the number of possibilities available for patients of ovarian cancer. And she talks about the prominent attitudes about ovarian cancer that exist in healthcare. Gubar makes the claim that instead of curing, the treatment imperils and debilitates the person till they turn unrecognizable. So she acknowledges that her own memoir is also tempered by her suspicions of the medical establishment. So she states, to quote, "Like many women of my generation, I doubted the popularity of an elective procedure which manifested, I suspected, the propensity of most male doctors to regard women's reproductive organs as diseased or abnormal." End quote. She's referring to the debulking surgery in ovarian cancer, which is a massive and very traumatic surgery for the body. Now, Gobar's experiences do little to revise any biases or fears about the prejudices that medical practice has. And she writes about a lot of the indignified and debilitating effects that are not discussed by women in fear of mortification, sort of breaking that silence around ovarian cancer, a much less recognized form of cancer than breast cancer. So the symptoms of ovarian cancer are the hardest to detect and perhaps could lead in part to how much of the treatment protocols still lead to death, except after long and truncated procedures of surgery and chemotherapy. In 1978, theorists and art historian and critic Susan Sontag wished to draw attention to the danger of synonymizing death with cancer. She even made the radical claim that metaphor can kill, drawing attention to the power of metaphorical associations around illness, the idea that language has powerful ways of helping us make our decisions about health and determining what we think of as positive or negative outcomes for ourselves. So this is that aspect of how scientific truths are assimilated by our bodies. So 30 years after Sontag makes this claim in 1978, Susan Gobar insists in her memoir that some cancers are still synonymous with a death sentence, and how this is not an innocent association between death and metaphor. So another instance of life writing, When Breath Becomes Air, was published posthumously in 2015, was written by Paul Kalanithi, a neurosurgeon, about his life in the wake of terminal lung cancer. Now, this memoir brings into focus the shifting nature of life's meaning in the context of terminal illness, sort of a struggle between hope and acceptance, and reflects on Kalanithi's personal transformation from physician to patient self-reflexively. Now, while writing this memoir, Kalanithi expresses that he has no certainty about how much time he has left. And this, when we read it, adds to the strength and pertinence of his insights, as that uncertainty of time is sort of negotiated and accepted. And the specific sort of contribution that the memoir makes is that this awareness of mortality leads to the formation of a new way of living for the author. And in this new way of living, there's an embracing of values that are dearest and a reassessment of values. And Kalanithi makes the move of inviting his readers to explore living differently through illness and learning to embrace death in terminal illness instead of resisting it for a compromised quality of life, which is offered by many treatments. I cannot perhaps comment extensively on life writing in India, but briefly, it has seen some key literary and political moments in the last decade. One such instance is novelist and professor of English Gayatri Prabhu's recent memoir titled If I Had to Tell It Again, published in 2017. Now, this memoir is a pioneering work in terms of its craft, and it makes unique formal interventions because Prabhu uses techniques to capture a dialogue with her father through the text. And one of these techniques is there's a play written within the memoir. So the writing itself is woven around the complex relationship that the author shared with her father and the legacies she inherited from him, both a passion for storytelling and a long, sustained struggle with depression. So the author in this text unravels multiple spools of experience and history, childhood trauma and adult suffering, witnessing depression in a parent and living with it herself. Now, our Indian subcontinent has a bare, countable number of narratives that engage with mental illness directly, And often these narratives take the form of fiction, as in Jerry Pinto's M in the Big Home, Amandeep Sandhu's Sepia Leaves, Meera Kandaswamy's work, and so on. So in that context of a lack of a biopic culture which we have, Prabhu's memoir challenges the stigma and silence around psychiatric and psychological struggles and mental health in India. So autobiographical accounts ask us to think about medical and health humanities as methodology. Returning to Dr. Gayatri Prabhu, in her response to the 8th COM Attitude, Ethics and Communication Model of Medical Education 2018, she states in an IJME article in 2019, to quote her, training in the discipline, referring to medical humanities, would include reflection on how to read, listen, or encounter narrative, its subtexts and contexts, how to think critically and laterally outside, through, or around the problem-solving model, and how to incorporate contemporary scholarship from the humanities into our understanding of key debates on health, end quote. Now, this is the move that medical schools across the country need to be considering, because medical education in India continues to understand its engagement with the humanities in a linear manner instead of a critical, holistic one. I mean, there is no formula for producing ethical doctors, but we must assume that in designing courses on methodologies from the humanities, we should necessarily welcome humanities scholars and their pedagogies as experts into the medical classroom. As many theorists have pointed out, medicine is both a science and story, and the scientific and technological advancements of the 21st century are paralleled by a dehumanizing experience of disease in healthcare. It is no surprise then that life writing on illness has seen its highest numbers at the turn of the 21st century, in parallel with those advancements. And the story of illness then cannot be separated from the story of a person. And we need to move in a direction where there is a dialogue and conversation within the subcontinent that embraces life narratives and recognizes their potential for transformative healthcare. In the meantime, what I would say is that non-medical professionals can gain access to rich experiential accounts through these texts of life writing that tell us how one approach and method cannot work for the diverse, complex, and humane experience of illness. Despite how medical memoirs have reading audiences who have shared in similar illnesses and can directly empathize and understand, or even challenge these accounts, they invite readers who have no such direct experiential knowledge, and they do so by exposing the most defenseless aspects of the illness experience, what we would think of as the most personal aspects. And this is found in the very deeply reflective accounts that we have about the meanings of life, health, and mortality, and what it means to be faced with that finitude in illness. Thank you. I have come to the end of my talk today.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. We'll just open the floor for any comments, questions, any points for discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Niharika.
So you may type it out in the chat box, or you may raise your hands. So I'll unmute you, and you may proceed with your comment or some point that you want to discuss, an idea or a question. Meera, would you like starting with a question so that we can open the floor then?
Sure, absolutely. So thank you so much, Amla, for that beautiful way you put a lot of things in. So I wanted to ask you, I'm sure you would have read multiple memoirs by now. And how do you see shame, empathy, and sympathy, some of those are very prominent emotions that come across in memoir writing, as far as I know. How do you see them being negotiated in memoirs? Like the self-expression of the writer himself or herself, and how they negotiate with between these emotions of empathy and sympathy, both. What do you have to say about it?
Oh, that's an excellent question, Meera. Thank you. Empathy, sympathy, and shame. So there are three strong sort of keywords, I think, in memoirs. And what I mean by that is the empathy itself is something that I think the reader experiences. And, the memoir sort of invites or opens up their empathy, but in a way that, I mean, every memoir that I have read, one gets the sense that these authors are asking for a recognition of, an experience of illness, but also their own sort of negotiation and their journey in a way that moves beyond their immediate illness experience. So in the sense that, except for a couple of instances, a lot of these are written away from that experience, in the sense it's written in the aftermath or after a period of time has elapsed. So it's in that making sense of the experience itself. The writer often guides the direction in which the reading needs to happen, which is very interesting for us as scholars, because does that necessarily determine our experience? And speaking more directly to how the writer themselves sort of negotiate these three things, there's a lot of um, recognition of medical practice or the specific ways in which one feels dehumanized, I guess, in the experience of both illness, just that intense vulnerability that one experiences in illness, and more so because of the restrictions and the problems with our healthcare systems, where we don't necessarily get the time to see the person beyond the patient, right? Especially for our context. So all of those things, I guess, Meera, do get very interestingly represented. And there is both a writing of them in the memoir and also an invitation for us to recognize and interpret what we think should be the emotion while reading, what we think should be happening when we understand the illness experience, and also the larger commentary that the text makes about prejudices in society, drawing from the idea of shame. A lot of these illnesses carry shame, right? Especially AIDS or even breast cancer. I've read an account where somebody gets treatment much later because they're ashamed of just recognizing the illness in their own body. And how do we get to that shame is a question that the writers are asking, necessarily because of the biases that we have, and where do these biases come from. So you sort of get that whole unraveling, in certain memoirs.
Thank you so much. One question, I think this question is by Sita. Have any memoirs addressed early stages which could give important information on early symptoms? So,
Sure.
would
Thank
that
you for
be,
that.
yeah.
I think a lot of memoirs do talk about, so it depends on the writers in the sense that Susan Gubar's memoir, which I was just talking about, talks about the illness from a very symptomatic, like she talks about the diagnosis, talks about the symptoms from the beginning, and does a very detailed expression of it. But that's in response to a sort of absence of awareness about ovarian cancer. So the memoirs on mental health don't always go into particular symptom wise sort of deconstruction, but I guess it depends on the sort of statement that the memoir is also trying to put across. Like, is it awareness that's the intention? not that there is one intention, there are multiple intentions, but also is it to say these are the symptoms that nobody tells you about or that is listed, and you will find them on WebMD, but do you know what the experience of it is like? And if you don't, this is the way you can sort of imagine it through my experience, my being the authors. So yeah.
Thank you for the answer. Another question is by Dilip. He's asking, are these memoirs in the form of poetry or plays? Because they're usually written in a paragraph form. So he wants to know if it's in other forms also, is it available?
Thanks, Dilip. I know that Gayatri Prabhu's memoir, for instance, has a play within the prose. So she sort of plays with the form of the memoir, which predominantly is prose, like a prose text that resembles any accounts of nonfiction. But yeah, people have been experimenting with form in that sense, and I've not seen play as a form used often. Poetry, you might find authors using poetry just as instances of expression within the memoir, and also sometimes just writing about illness through poetry, but memoirs generally stick to prose, I think.
Okay. Thank you for the answer. Another question is that memoirs of disease or illness are transformative for the speaker, for the reader and the writer. What are the intention of the writer? Like, because you mentioned challenging diagnosis, so the question is directed there.
Okay. So I wouldn't take, sort of the spotlight away from the writers to say there is one intention. I think each memoirist comes to the text with a unique awareness about illness and also about that sense of recovery. Or as I mentioned in Paul Kalanithi's case, he was writing when he was terminally ill. So that's a unique memoir there, because while he's writing, he's aware that he may not be able to even finish the memoir, right? So they're transformative for the reader in the sense that we don't necessarily have a way to access experiences of illness unless we have them ourselves. And when someone puts across a narrative, which is, and here I want to make the distinction that literary memoirs craft experience. So it isn't experience as it was exactly, it's crafted for readership, right? So it's trying to reach that reader. And the intentions of the writer, I think I would have to go back to generally what memoirs do. They range from making sense of the experience, and they're trying to say, okay, this is often people say, why I wrote it is because I went through this and I want to sit down and understand what happened. And that's one big intention. But the other is also, of course, to reclaim the self, because a lot of recovery processes or treatment protocols make you feel less sort of part of a big system and not so much like an individual. So it is a reclamation of the body and the self. That would be a strong intention for the writer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another question. Okay. One question is actually by Professor Sangeetha Menon. So, if ma'am, can I request you to please say the question?
Yeah, well,
Yes, ma'am is here. Ma'am, please. Oh, ma'am, you're muted. Sorry, ma'am. Yeah.
okay. I was saying that I was hoping Niharika's voice would be a conveyor for my question, but I guess destiny is not that. So what I perhaps wanted to, I also have Amala Poli's book, because Meera Menon told me about her book some months back, and I immediately bought it and I've kept it as a treasure. Wonderful writing. So what I wanted to ask Amala Poli and perhaps all of us is, can one write oneself? Is self amenable to be revealed or expressed through writing? Since any form of writing is fictional to some degree by being a narrative. So whose self is written and who writes? So thanks.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, both for taking my book and sort of giving it your time and your attention, and also for this wonderful question. I think you found the crux of course, what I think as scholars we're all drawn to, in the sense, can the self be amenable to writing? I think is a very significant question. And this is, I think, what I've come close to understanding it is by thinking of it as how memoirs are crafted. And that's what I meant by they are crafted for an audience. So, which is also why often when memoirs are published, you'll find the immediate family or friends or people saying, I don't remember it like this at all. So in that sense, it is a rewriting of the self as much as a writing. And I would invite maybe Meera or anyone else to chip in and talk about what they think of, is it even possible as, you know, as philosophers, as thinkers, for us to imagine a self being written that's absolutely real and not fictional to some degree?
If I may, Niharika?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. So, Amla, as much as you are interested in biology and philosophy, Sangeetha ma'am is also somebody who shares those interests with you, and she, she has researched extensively in health humanities. So, and I think the way she asked the question, she does this many times, where she gives you a very striking question, and then you keep wondering and wondering. I mean, is self amenable to writing, like you all said, it's something that we all try to bring out, like connect ourselves with others through our writing as writers or scholars. I think writing or expressing oneself is as close as it can possibly get. So, or artistic expression of any kind may it be. But like your book also says, I think it quotes Woolf, who says a childish outspokenness is seen in illness, right? So probably it when it is an illness memoir, it sort of strikes the most innocent, most vulnerable part of ourselves, which we then might be able to pour out. Also, when it comes to memoirs, I think there is a sense of finitude to some extent, especially when it is coming from terminally ill people. And I think there you can see both vulnerability and strength both coming together, which is not something that is as accessible for everybody, probably. So I think there a very strong as well as vulnerable expression of self is possible.
Okay. Do you want to say something, Amla?
Yeah, I would just, if we have time, like to hear
sure,
ma'am's
please.
thoughts on the subject too. I mean, her own insight from her research and her work. Perhaps it would be very helpful for me in my own work.
Okay. Sangeetha ma'am?
Yeah, well, you know, the problem with philosophers is they talk and talk. So you wouldn't want me to ask to talk because others won't get an opportunity to speak. But I think it's extremely important to do that self-reflection where thought itself stops when we ask whose self is writing and whose self is being written. Because it's like a conundrum, because can the self which is being written can also do the writing? So it's like, it's like almost like a Zen question, which perhaps cannot give an answer readily. But I think that question is very important because it allows us the space for reflecting upon the nature of the person who is writing, as well as of the self being written, and therefore perhaps give a different perspective itself. And I think Dr. Shankar's question, which is shared, is also related to that. So, because anything which is written also shares a particular emotion or a particular value, an emotive value. So I guess in that context, it's also interesting to see. I think. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, before taking Shankar's questions, there's also one question by Dr. Priya. And the question is, how thin is the line between experience and imagination, reality and fiction in these memoirs?
Well, I think there are scholars in the studies of memory and consciousness now who would say that after a certain time period, all memory can be called fictional. So that's the absolute position there. But, you know, to a degree, whenever going back to Sangeetha ma'am's question, every time that we try to craft personal experience, I think there are elements of it that are coming from the imagination. But my understanding of how memoirists themselves perceive this is that they find it valuable that that imaginative aspect is not so much a divergence from the truth as much as their sense of that experience. So in terms of real life diversions, I mean, there have been some famous instances, and not related to medical memoirs, but where authors have claimed experience that hasn't happened to them, and it has come out in public spotlight and all of that. So that's a different kind of problem. If someone puts forth an identity or claims an experience that they didn't actually have, that poses a very ethical problem. But in writing your experience, if the idea is to be as truthful as possible to yourself, then I think what is produced has a great value in that it's a retelling of an experience, but from to a degree it would be informed by, I don't know if I would call it fiction, but I would definitely say it has creative imagination or elements of that in it. But so I don't know if that would be, for me, it doesn't take away from the truth of the experience. And that is the question I think this draws us back to. Like, does that mean there is some fictionality to the experience itself? Or if so, in the crafting, if elements of imagination exist, which they always must, because writing tends to do that, what does that mean for the readers? I think I don't know if there's an answer to that question directly. So anyone's, of course, welcome to chip in. Niharika.
Thank you. The question by Dr. Shankar Rajaraman is, what is the gamut of emotions that is covered in these illness memoirs? Are they bleak and dominated by sadness or by grit in the face of irreversibility?
Thank you. Thank you, sir. The gamut of emotions. So I think I can talk about tone in a couple of these memoirs. In Paul Kalanithi's memoir, it's bravery is something that you see in every page, but also there is an attempt to be as realistic as possible. You know, it's a very, sometimes that can mean having humor. And I haven't really read a memoir where sadness dominates the text. It's more definitely grit, but also desire to communicate anger. In the case of, say, Susan Kobar, it's an anger against the lack of awareness about ovarian cancer, the lack of options, questions like why isn't there more funding for this type of cancer, and is that indicating a historical bias against women's bodies, or hysteria as it was imagined earlier. So all of these questions, sort of in the expression of emotion, they cover a range of emotions. And what is very unique to, I think, illness memoirs is sometimes memoirists can take an approach of humor to a very bleak situation. So I guess it has an entire gamut of emotions.
Thank you. We have two more interesting questions. One is by Mr. Manu and the other is by Dr. Saurabh Todaria. Can I request Mr. Manu to please ask his question? So is it possible for you to ask your question yourself?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Yeah, so I wanted to just ask, at what points does medical humanities and memoirs intersect with the spirituality, the notion of the existence of God or a higher power, or the sense of self, like in Atman? Uh, so, what are the points where these intersect? And also, spirituality usually you detach from your body and ultimately detach from your mind as well. So if that comes in, then along with reclaiming the body, when you're writing a memoir, you are actually detaching from the body as well, in some sense. So I just wanted to see what you think about that.
That's a very unique question for sure. I think existence of God or the sense of a higher power, there is, I think you do get a reflection of somebody's personal take on that as to whether or not they have a sense of such a higher power. As to the detachment of oneself from mind and body, I don't recall reading anything that directly reflects on it, but there is definitely, I think, a spiritual overtone to even discussing recovery has spiritual overtone. Sometimes in the way an author might express how in a deep depression they've taken up painting, there's something very spiritual about the way that itself is conveyed. Directly, perhaps I don't recall any instances, but I would say if anybody does, I would be glad to hear about it myself too.
Okay. Thank you. I'll request Dr. Saurabh Todaria to ask his question. Then Sukanya, we'll come back to your question after Saurabh's question. Okay. Dr. Saurabh? Sorry.
Thanks, Amala, for this wonderful and enriching talk. So this is basically more than the question. It is just kind of the clarification I need. So one thing is that what are the base, because recently we have seen that in the narrative meditation, there are convergence between phenomenology and the narrative meditation, especially in the work of the Craig Irwin, who oftenly writes on the embodiment, especially from the Merleau-Ponty's point of view, that basically the diseases for him is the disruption of the lived body. So, so how do you see that? Because this provides a wide methodology for the narrative medicines to analyze the narration. And second, because to build a narrative is also to evaluate, as like in the works of Paul Ricoeur, who say our identity is basically narrative identity. So we project and also evaluate. So in that situation, what is the narrative ethics? Because especially for the healthcare professional, if someone is like caught in his own framework of the evaluation, which is in the conflicting situation with some others evaluation, with some other evaluation or value crisis it has. So how does the medical professional, what is the narrative ethics in that? Or is it purely descriptive only?
Thank you so much, Dr. Saurabh. Yeah, so the Craig Irwin part, what it is like to be embodied and how that comes across in an illness narrative, perhaps I can speak to a little bit. I think sometimes you get the sense that illness forces one to be embodied in a way that not much else can. There is no escaping that sense of being embodied, and that is something that you do get that sense across the board. So then that phenomenological aspect where people talk about how exactly a bodily experience is, that it can be, as a reader, it can be very stunning to read, because sometimes you see people who have written very detailed accounts of what, you know, in a sense are things that before the confessional era were considered intensely personal, or things that we wouldn't reveal outside of our immediate homes. And that, well, it's a wonderful turn that we now get to hear about these things, but also it draws attention, I think, to that very inescapable sense of being in the world and what it means in illness. And of course, I would like to hear your own thoughts on that, because I think I've only read it as being phenomenological. I haven't necessarily read its implications for that sort of philosophical approach about building a narrative and the frameworks for narrative ethics. Now, physicians who have written memoirs that speak to illness have, of course, I'm sure their experience is very unique, of sort of embodying both identities at the same time. But you also hear about what it happens once the memoir is in the world. Like Jameson, as a psychologist, has written about both sets of responses, a lot of welcoming acceptance from the community of psychologists, but also a lot of negativity that she's received. And even to the point that she wondered if she should have written that memoir at all, which, I mean, its absence would be a great loss to the understanding of bipolar disorder. But, you know, the personal sort of ramifications for writers, I think, are immense, especially physicians who are actually, perhaps not, especially physicians. It depends on the type of illness that the memoir is speaking to as well. Psychological struggles or mental illness, I think, has a very sort of troubling relationship with stigma that follows the author around after its writing. And in that sense, I don't want to say that the author's brave and leave it at that, but I think there is an acknowledgement that perhaps the implications of that writing only become clearer much later, even by the authors. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'll request Sukanya to please proceed with the question.
Yeah, thank you, Niharika. Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful lecture. I'm actually working with the indigenous healing traditions of tribal communities of Kerala under Sangeetha, ma'am. So, as you know, the indigenous community's notion of health and illness is very unique in nature. So, especially we went to the field and discussed about the causes of illness. They have so many stories. Since their childhood, they are hearing so many stories like the causes of illness because of the spirit or supernatural power, like that. So, I would like to know your viewpoints on the role of culture on the illness narrative, especially with the indigenous communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sukanya. That's a brilliant question, really. In the sense that I think a lot of the writing that we see is, I have to say that predominantly in my work, I did study Western literary memoirs, but that is not because of so much at very key interest in the Western literary memoirs, but more because I was interested in how contemporary Western medicine is receiving responses to its practices. But to what Sukanya has highlighted, I think every culture tells its own stories about illness and health. And the sense that theorists and authors have sort of put across is that those stories determine our experience and understanding of illness. So they shape that response to the bodily experience, and they decide what one perceives oneself as being a terrible illness, as a recoverable illness, as a curse, maybe, there is a whole range of things, right? And I wouldn't ever say that one cultural understanding dominates another, because that is absolutely, you know, not the case. But at the same time, it's that I think if we had a way in which our practices of care could recognize that diversity in understanding, you know, could recognize how these cultural specificities shape our understanding of illness, then we would be at a great advantage to figuring out how to guide the recovery process as well.
Thank you. We'll just quickly take two more questions before we invite the chairperson of today's session to give her comments. One question is by Saifji. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. So can you please introduce yourself and please ask your question? Yeah, I'm unmuting you. You have to unmute yourself from your end now. Yeah, thank you. You're not audible. No, you're still not audible. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, for some reason you're not audible to us. Oh, okay. How about you try to figure it out? I'll just request Nishita to please proceed with her question. We'll circle back to your question, Sevji. Yeah, please proceed with your question.
Hi, Amla. Thank you so much for this talk. Because we were having these discussions along the lines of, spirituality and illness and experiential writing. This book just came up in my head of Lata Mani's. It's like I put it in the comment box. I'll say that again. So the book's name is Interleaves, Ruminations on Illness and Spiritual Life. So I happened to chance this through a documentary that was screened in St. John's, The Poetics of Fragility. So I was wondering, what exactly would you have regarding, your take on this Poetics of Fragility, if you watched, or this particular book?
Thank you, Nishita. It's wonderful to see you again, and thank you for your question. I'm familiar with Lata Mani, but I have not read Interleaves yet. I think I would prefer to hear your thoughts and perhaps insight on the text, and then we can maybe respond to that.
The Poetics of Fragility, when I watched, like we were having these discussions along courage and it's not fear, etc., etc. So again, it's not the skill of the documentary maker, but the way Lata Mani has captured the experience of not just her illness, but many other people's illness, and to make the viewer feel it viscerally. So I thought that's something very gifted, because you don't see that quite often. So, and I was curious about this book. So before reading the book, I thought, I get an idea about what is your take, because we're having these discussions on spirituality and stuff. And hence, the question. Yeah.
I think illness does open up an entirely different understanding of a spiritual self, for those exploring that. And more to your point about the visceral experience of it, I think that relates to a lot of ideas about embodiment here too. And in a sense, I think the more visceral an experience of reading or viewing something, the more it sort of one can actually truly experience empathy. I think the more visceral some experience is portrayed as, and it can also be really hard. I think some of these texts for reading or writing, especially if someone has I found that when people have a similar experience or have a parent or a friend or someone who's gone through an illness and read about it then from a memoirist, then that can be really sort of gut-wrenching, right? But I think there's great value to experiencing that particular visceral sensation, Nishita, and that's, I think you're right in the sense of it does immensely change our own ideas about how, you hear about somebody getting sick, it's like, this happened, it's done. What happened there, you don't really get a sense of it. And in this COVID-19 time now, we are going to hear so many narratives about the experience of, and we are hearing them right now, about that very, this was day one, this is what happened, this is day two. And it does so much for, right now it does a lot to create, I think, a sense of fear and sense of recognition as much as a sense of the person's bravery, right? So this is happening in a way that I guess a lot of memoirs haven't happened. And we are all still in a context of getting or being exposed to a virus, and narratives are coming out simultaneously. So I think for interested theorists, this is a very unique moment in history where experience is being narrated while it is happening, you know. So
Thank you so much for the answer and also for the question, Panishita. And once again, we'll try. Sevji, can you try speaking once more? Otherwise, I'll read your question.
Thank you. Am I audible now?
You're audible. Can you please introduce yourself and proceed with your question?
Sure. So my name is Sevgi. I have just graduated from IIT Gandhinagar from the program of MA in Society and Culture. My work has been mainly on phenomenology of pain, but I'm very much interested in health and medical humanities as well. So my question is regarding the way these memoirs are studied, especially by some of my colleagues. And of course, my personal interest also plays in this. So speaking of the author as the true experiencer of the illness and a dynamic experiencer of the illness throughout the writing process, because we know that some memoirs are written while the person is still suffering and some of them are quite retrospective. So speaking of the writing process, would psychoanalytic reading of memoirs, reading between the lines or seeing the stoppages or seeing the pauses, or in fact, some of them are very much visible in experimental writing or memoirs, would, doing psychoanalytic reading of them as an attempt to capture consciousness of the author beyond what is described in the text, would it become a delusional outcome of a futile attempt? Would it kind of give further insights? What is your take on that? My question was that. Thank you so much.
thank you so much, Sevgi. That's again a very insightful and interesting question. I honestly feel like blessed to be in this opportunity and hearing from all of you wonderful scholars and thinkers, and having the audience to both discuss these questions with and share my ideas with. So thank you for that. Sevgi, I think I am no expert in speaking to psychoanalytic methods, but I think we have to, if we were to think of doing that attempt at capturing consciousness, I think we would have to be a little bit careful in acknowledging that history of psychoanalytic readings, particularly if these authors are coming to the text with such sort of clear political stances and resistances. So then I think I would be interested, as you mentioned, in what sort of a consciousness would a psychoanalytic reading be attempting to garner? And like what would be, I guess, my interest in such a reading would be to see what outcome are we hoping to gather, or like what insight are we hoping to gather? I think psychoanalytic readings that talk about the double consciousness or the sense of self and society that comes across from the memoirs, I think all of those can be very productive. But I think there is a caveat, a need to be a bit on the careful side if we venture into those. And if you have a thought there, and Niharika, if you think we have the time, I would definitely like to hear.
Yeah.
You.
Okay.
Thank you. Your thought too, Sevgi.
No, actually, I'm also in the same opinion as yours, because even the question of self has been there, right? We are not sure if, like, what kind of process is the person having while writing that. And on the one hand, there's the death of the author in the textual sense. On the other hand, there is the memoir aspect of it. So my question was also that I was thinking we need to be cautious, but I still wanted to know what you are thinking of it, or is there any other way of seeing it? Is there any other way of seeing further than what is described? Because there's a whole life outside of that text, and how should we approach that? But thank you so much for your answer.
Thank you so much for the wonderful question and for the wonderful answer. So we are running a little ahead of time. So now I'll request the chairperson of today's session, Meera Menon. Meera Menon is a doctoral scholar with our team CSP. So I'll request Meera to please go ahead with her comments. Over to you, Meera.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you so much, Amala, for generously agreeing to come and speak. Especially, we are aware of the time difference at 6:30 in the morning when we started, and you were a spot. You were so keen on talking, and thank you so much for that. And the discussion was, I'm sure, as interesting as it was for me, for you too. So many questions and so many interested people, so many interesting suggestions. So, I mean, I cannot help but agree with almost everything you said. It was all so beautifully put. Only one thing that that I thought was striking is when we read through these memoirs and the theories, especially all the grand statements that we make as literature scholars and the grander theories we make. You know, the very simple experience of going to the indigenous healing places and trying to understand the healing traditions of theirs. What I have felt is that while there is a one way where we are complicating everything, where we understand the complexities as well, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but there is also a very simple narrative that is a counterpart, or what shall I say? There is a simpler life, a simpler meaning-making process that is also there somewhere. Especially when I go to these places, I see that their processes of understanding are cannot say it is not complex, but more organic in nature. And I think there is a caveat between understanding the grand statements that we make and the simpler lives that are also going on in another world, if I might say so. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Apart from that, I think all these narratives, we kind of think that, oh, this is going to be a sad narrative. For instance, when all of us have been discussing Kalanidhi's text for quite some time, and I think we tend to see it as a sad as a sad story, especially when it comes to memoirs of terminally ill people. But the resilience, the resistance, the story of overcoming is all there too. Like when we look at motivational speakers, for instance, they all seem to derive a lot of strength from their illnesses, whether they are terminally ill or otherwise. So I think at some point we might also want to look at illness narratives as narratives of motivation, narratives of inspiration for life, and so forth as well. I mean, not to end at a very bleak note. And I do not know if my optimism is probably getting a little naive at this point, but regardless, I think we could also look at them as inspirational and motivational as well. That's about it, Amala.
Thank you so much, Meera. Niharika, do I have a quick minute to respond to Meera? And
Yeah, please go ahead with it.
Thank you, Niharika. Meera, thank you so much. I think you're very right, and there needs to be a level of appreciation for the simplicity of narrative selves. And I think in that sense, we have to be careful with literary analysis or any sort of analysis of written narratives, and how we understand and approach oral narratives, I think would be my sort of point in addition and speaking to yours. I think that's where we would need to be careful with interpretation and analysis. In the writing of a text, of course, I think an author opens up their narrative for a certain level of a sort of reading and interpretation, which we are all interested in doing, of course. But like you say, there is a deeply appreciative simplicity that I hope to bring too to certain narratives of, health and illness. But and they are definitely, these accounts are definitely very, very inspirational, and there's a lot in that sense from a pedagogic point to learn from that bravery. But I have been shy of highlighting that aspect in my writing, just because I think it's to say that sometimes when the bleakness can be political as much as, and not to say that the writers are being bleak, that's not at all my intention, but I think I have resisted reading. I mean, I've read them as inspirational, like you said. I find them inspiring, but I've tried not to say so explicitly, just so that I can direct attention more to the other aspects of the writing. But I agree with you wholeheartedly in the sense that I personally find these accounts very, very motivational and inspiring. And thank you so much.
Meera, do you have any follow-up comments?
Just wanted to say, I thought it was very beautiful when you said if our practices of care could recognize differences. I think that was a very, very inclusive way of looking at all care practices. So yeah, I just wanted to say that again.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Meera, for your comments, and thank you, Amla, for the wonderful lecture, and also to all the participants to make each event of NIAS CSP a success by joining, by being patient with us via emails, also with your questions, and also listening to the lectures. So thank you, everyone, on behalf of Team CSP and also on behalf of Professor Sangeetha Menon. So we'll meet you next Friday with another interesting lecture. The upcoming lecture is on Kalari. So it's by Mr. Ranjan Mulrat. So he has an interesting lecture planned for us next Friday. So Team CSP will bring to you more such lectures. So stay tuned with us for each Friday and a new interesting lecture and a new speaker. So thank you, everyone. I'll see you next Friday. Have a great evening.